On a quiet morning in 2016, inside a high-security nursing home in Monroeville, Harper Lee finally escaped the silence she had guarded for 55 years. Blind, deaf, and confined to a wheelchair, the woman who wrote America's moral compass didn't die in peace, but amidst a firestorm of elder abuse allegations and a suspicious book release she likely never wanted. She had spent decades running from the world that worshipped her, only to have her privacy stripped away and her rawest drafts sold for millions when she was finally too weak to fight back. But the tragedy didn't start in that nursing home. It began the moment To Kill a Mockingbird became a global phenomenon. This is the autopsy of a writer paralyzed by the terror of her own success and slowly erased by the betrayal of her childhood friend Truman Capote, who used her research to build his own legend while leaving her behind. We must peel back the layers of the reclusive spinster to find a woman who saw the world's cruelty so clearly that she decided to put down her pen, lock the door, and never let anyone in again. She was born on April 28, 1926, in Monroeville, Alabama. If you have read To Kill a Mockingbird, you know this town. In the book, she christened it Maycomb, but the geography of the fiction mapped perfectly onto the reality of her childhood. Lee described it best in her opening chapter, a tired old town where people moved slowly then. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. But Monroeville was more than just tired. It was a place of rigid stratification. It was a small hamlet of about 1,300 people, nestled in the piney woods between Montgomery and Mobile. It was a place where your last name determined your future before you took your first breath. It was a deeply religious, deeply segregated, and deeply insular community. In 1926, the memory of the Civil War was not history. It was living memory. Old men sat on the benches of the courthouse square, their bodies scarred by battles fought 60 years prior, muttering about the war of northern aggression. This was the world Nell entered. She was the youngest of 4 children, a surprise baby, born to a mother who was already exhausted by life. From the moment she could walk, Nell made it clear she was not like the other girls in Monroe County. She didn't care for dolls, tea sets, or the frilly dresses that were the uniform of the Southern belle in training. Nell was a scrap of a girl, a rough and tumble tomboy with a bowl cut and a gaze that could cut glass. She was quick with a fist and even quicker with a sharp word. She was known to curse, a shocking transgression for a young lady of her station, and she preferred the company of boys, mostly because they played rougher. But while the town saw a scruffy, combative kid, Nell was doing something else. She was observing. She was watching the way the white shopkeepers spoke to the black sharecroppers. She was watching the way the ladies of the missionary circle gossiped while claiming to do the Lord's work. She was collecting the data that would one day indict them all. If Nell was the observer, her father was the subject. Amasa Coleman Lee, known to everyone as AC, was the center of her universe. In the American imagination, A.C. Lee has been inextricably fused with Atticus Finch. We picture him as Gregory Peck, tall, handsome, possessing a soothing baritone voice and an infinite well of patience. The reality, as is often the case, was sharper and darker. A.C. Lee was a man of stiff, quiet dignity, but he was also a man of his time. He was born in 1880 on a farm in Florida, the son of a Confederate veteran. He clawed his way up from rural obscurity to become a lawyer, a newspaper editor, and a member of the Alabama state legislature. In Monroeville, he was not just a citizen. He was a pillar. He wore 3-piece suits in the stifling Alabama summer, sweating through his collar but never loosening his tie. He was a man who believed in the law with a capital L. However, the event that defined his life and subsequently defined his daughter's morality occurred 7 years before Nell was born. It is the seed from which To Kill a Mockingbird grew. In 1919, A.C. Lee was appointed to defend two black men, a father and son named F.C. and D.L. Bose. They were accused of murdering a white storekeeper. The evidence was murky, the circumstances suspicious. A.C. Lee, a young lawyer, then took the case seriously. He argued that there was no proof, that the prosecution was relying on prejudice rather than fact. He believed that the system would work. He believed that if he presented the truth, the jury, 12 white men, would see it. He was wrong. The jury didn't care about the evidence. They didn't care about the presumption of innocence. They returned a guilty verdict in record time. F.C. and D.L. Bose were hanged. That failure haunted A.C. Lee. It wasn't just a professional loss. It was a moral catastrophe. He had looked into the eyes of two men he believed were innocent, and he had watched the state kill them. After the execution, A.C. Lee changed. He never took another criminal case. He shifted his practice entirely to civil law, property disputes, wills, tax law. He could not bear to hold a man's life in his hands again when the game was so clearly rigged. Young Nell grew up in the shadow of this silent grief. She would sit on his lap while he read the newspaper, absorbing his quiet demeanor. She worshipped him. He treated her not like a child, but like a small adult, discussing politics and business with her. He taught her that the law was a sacred thing, even if the people administering it were flawed. But he also taught her through his own weariness that justice was not guaranteed. While A.C. Lee was the pillar of stability, the other half of Nell's parentage was a source of chaos that has been carefully scrubbed from the polished legacy of Harper Lee. In To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout's mother is dead. She is a memory, a ghost who died when Scout was 2. Atticus raises the children alone. This was perhaps the greatest piece of fiction Nell ever wrote. She erased her mother from the story because the reality of Frances Cunningham Finch was too painful, too complex, and perhaps too shameful to put on the page. Frances Finch was a woman of high pedigree. She came from the Virginia gentry, a descendant of wealthy planters. She played the piano beautifully. She was educated. But inside the Lee household on South Alabama Avenue, Frances was the storm. Frances suffered from a condition that in the 1920s and 30s had no compassionate name. Today we would likely diagnose her with severe bipolar disorder, perhaps complicated by narcissism. To the town of Monroeville, she was nervous. To her family, she was terrifying. She was prone to wild, hysterical outbursts. One moment she might be playing Chopin on the piano. The next she would be screaming at the children, throwing objects, or sinking into a depression so deep she refused to leave her bed for days. She was chemically imbalanced in an era that treated mental illness with silence and shame. Nell did not grow up with cookie-baking maternal warmth. She grew up navigating the minefield of her mother's moods. She learned to be quiet when the nerves were bad. She learned to make herself scarce. This dynamic created a profound sense of isolation in the young girl. It made her independent. She had to be. But it also left a hole in her heart where a mother's unconditional love should have been. The tragedy of Frances Lee was not just her illness, but her obesity. As her mental health deteriorated, she ate compulsively. She became immensely overweight, which only deepened her isolation and her shame. She rarely left the house, terrified of the town's judgment. This is the crucible in which Nell Harper Lee was forged. On one side, a father who represented the cold, hard, unreachable ideal of justice. On the other, a mother who represented the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of emotion. Caught in the middle was Nell, a little girl in overalls, looking for a way to make sense of it all. The stifling atmosphere of the Lee household, caught between the silent pressure of the law and the volatile storms of her mother's mind could have easily crushed a lesser spirit. Nell was desperate for an ally, someone who understood what it meant to be an outlier in a world of rigid conformity. Just as the walls of her home seemed to be closing in, a window opened in the form of a neighbor, a peculiar, brilliant spark that would ignite her imagination and change the course of her life forever. Fate, however, has a strange and often ironic sense of humor. Living right next door to this lonely, pugnacious tomboy was another lonely child, a tiny, effeminate boy with a shock of blonde hair and a high-pitched voice that sounded like a relentless saw. His name was Truman Persons, though the world would come to know him by his stepfather's surname, Truman Capote. Truman was a discard. While Nell was dealing with a mother who was too present in her chaos, Truman was dealing with a mother who was entirely absent. His mother, Lily Mae, was a beautiful, ambitious, and reckless woman who found motherhood inconvenient. She had deposited Truman with her elderly cousins in Monroeville so she could pursue a new life in New York. Truman was the boy left behind, the sissy in a town that prized rugged masculinity. They were the original odd couple, a pair of misfits who found solace in their shared alienation. Nell became his protector. When the local bullies cornered Truman, mocking his fancy clothes and his lisp, it was Nell who stepped in. She didn't use words, she used her fists. She beat up boys twice her size to defend the little boy next door. In exchange for her protection, Truman gave her a world. He was a fabulist, a liar, and a dreamer of the highest order. Together they retreated from the real world of Monroeville into a world of their own making. They congregated in a treehouse perched high in a chinaberry tree, away from the prying eyes of adults. There they shared a battered Underwood typewriter. They didn't just play, they worked. They wrote stories. They created characters. They were detectives, spying on the neighbors through windows and making up elaborate backstories for the people they saw. This was their training ground. They were sharpening the observational skills that would later make them two of the most famous writers in American history. Truman later immortalized Nell as the character Idabel in his debut novel Other Voices, Other Rooms, a girl who was brave, rough, and fiercely loyal. Nell, in turn, would immortalize Truman as Dill in To Kill a Mockingbird, the pocket Merlin, whose head teemed with eccentric plans. Their childhood was a shared hallucination of brilliance in a town that just wanted them to be normal. But childhood ends. Truman's mother eventually reclaimed him, dragging him off to New York, and Nell was left alone in the silence of Monroeville. As Nell grew older, the pressure to conform to her father's image intensified. A.C. Lee didn't understand a life in the arts. To him, writing was a hobby, not a profession. He wanted Nell to have a career, a standing, a secure future. He wanted her to be a lawyer. Nell, desperate to please the father she worshipped, tried to mold herself into his likeness. She enrolled at the University of Alabama to study law. She joined a sorority, the Chi Omega, but she was a disaster of a sorority sister. While the other girls discussed husbands and hemlines, Nell smoked a pipe, cursed like a sailor, and focused on her studies with a grim determination that bordered on misery. She was miserable because she was living a lie. She hated the law. She found the dry statutes and the endless case studies suffocating. She was a writer, and her soul was starving. In 1949, the dam broke. Just 6 months before she was scheduled to graduate, mere months away from taking the bar exam and securing the future her father had dreamed of, Nell Harper Lee quit. It was an act of supreme rebellion. She packed her bags and told her family she was moving to New York City to become a writer. A.C. Lee was crushed. He worried she would starve. He worried she would fail. But Nell, channeling that same stubbornness that had made her a neighborhood terror as a child, boarded the train anyway. She was 23 years old. The New York City that greeted Harper Lee in 1949 was not the glittering metropolis of the movies. For a struggling writer with no money, it was a city of cold water flats, walk-up apartments, and cheap diners. She reunited with Truman, who was already beginning to ascend the social ladder, becoming the toast of the town with his wit and his shock value writing. But while Truman was drinking martinis at the Colony Club, Nell was grinding. For 7 long years, the woman who would write the great American novel worked as a ticket reservation agent, first for Eastern Airlines, then for BOAC. It was grueling, mind-numbing work. She spent her days in a fluorescent-lit office, booking flights for wealthy travelers, politely answering phones and suppressing her creative urge. She lived in a tiny apartment on East 82nd Street. It had no hot water. She had to boil water on a hot plate to bathe. She had very little money for food, often surviving on grim, cheap meals. But she had discipline. Every night after an 8-hour shift at the airline, she would come home, sit at a makeshift desk, and write. She wrote short stories. She wrote essays. She sent them to magazines, and she collected rejection slips like they were stamps. She was tired. She was frustrated. She watched Truman skyrocket to fame while she remained invisible, a ticket agent with ink-stained fingers. She began to doubt if she had made a terrible mistake leaving Alabama. The turning point of Harper Lee's life sounds like a fabrication, a myth invented by a publicist, but it is entirely historically true. In New York, Nell had befriended a couple named Michael and Joy Brown. Michael was a lyricist and writer. Joy was a former dancer. They were creative, kind, and they saw something in Nell that perhaps she was beginning to lose sight of herself. Undeniable genius. They knew she was exhausted. They knew she couldn't write a novel while working full-time at the airline. On Christmas Day, 1956, Nell joined the Browns for their holiday celebration. The tree was lit, the mood was festive, but Nell was heavy with the dread of returning to the ticket counter the next day. As the gifts were exchanged, the Browns handed Nell an envelope. It was small and light. Nell opened it. Inside was a note written in Michael's hand. It read, "You have 1 year off from your job to write whatever you please. Merry Christmas." Along with the note was a check. It was a substantial sum, enough to cover her rent, her food, and her bills for exactly 1 year. Nell burst into tears. She tried to refuse it. It was too much. It was charity. But the Browns insisted. "It's not charity," Michael told her. "It's an investment in you. We believe in you." They had bought her freedom. Nell didn't waste a second. She quit her job at the airline the very next day. She sat down at her typewriter, the weight of the Browns' faith pressing on her shoulders. She had 1 year. She had to make it count. She poured out a manuscript in a fever. She mined her childhood, her father, her town. She called the book Go Set a Watchman. In 1957, she sent it to J.B. Lippincott, a prestigious publishing house. Now, this is where history usually gets simplified. People think she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. It got published and she became a star. That is not what happened. The manuscript landed on the desk of an editor named Tay Hohoff. Hohoff was a formidable woman, sharp, experienced, and possessing an unerring eye for talent. She read, "Go Set a Watchman." She saw a spark of genius, yes. The voice was unique, the dialogue rang true, but she also saw a mess. She told Lee the hard truth. This is not a novel. It is a series of anecdotes. In Watchmen, the character of Scout was a grown woman returning to Maycomb to visit her aging father. She was bitter, disillusioned, and angry at the racism she found in her hometown. It was a political rant disguised as a story. Hohoff made a brilliant, crucial suggestion. She pointed to the flashback sequences, the moments where the adult scout remembered her childhood. These, Hohoff said, these are the heart of the story. Take this story, but tell it entirely from the perspective of the little girl. Go back in time. Make the child the narrator. It was a radical request. It meant throwing away nearly everything Nell had written and starting over. For the next 2.5 years, Harper Lee lived in what she called a deeply stoned state of exhaustion. She wasn't on drugs. She was drunk on fatigue. She rewrote. She revised. She wrestled with the structure. She sat in her cold apartment, chain-smoking cigarettes, drinking instant coffee and struggling to channel the voice of a 6-year-old girl. The pressure was immense. The year of money from the Browns had run out. She was living on meager advances and the kindness of friends. There is a famous story from this period that illustrates just how close we came to never having to kill a mockingbird. One winter night, in a fit of absolute frustration, unable to get a chapter right, Nell gathered up the entire manuscript, hundreds of pages. She walked to the window of her apartment, opened it, and threw the pages out into the dirty New York snow. She watched them flutter down into the air shaft. It was over. She was done. She called Tay Hohoff, weeping. She told the editor what she had done. Hohoff, tough as nails and unwilling to let talent go to waste, didn't coddle her. She barked an order. You march downstairs and pick every single page up immediately, dry them off, and get back to work. Nell did. She went out into the cold, gathered the wet, smudged pages, and ironed them flat. And thank goodness she did, because that snow-covered stack of paper was the chrysalis of To Kill a Mockingbird. Finally, in 1960, the book was done. Nell Harper Lee had taken the raw anger of Watchmen and refined it into the pure, poignant nostalgia of Mockingbird. She had turned a political screech into a human song. She had no idea that she had just lit a fuse. She had braced herself for failure, preparing to return to the quiet anonymity of her previous life as an airline clerk. She had written her truth and was ready to bury it. But the universe had a different script in mind. When the book finally left her hands and entered the public consciousness, the silence she craved was shattered not by the criticism she expected, but by a roar of acclaim so deafening it would echo for the rest of her life. On July 11, 1960, To Kill a Mockingbird was released into the world. Nell had kept her expectations aggressively low. She had warned her friends not to buy it, fearing it would be embarrassing. She hoped for a few polite reviews and perhaps enough sales to justify a second modest advance. Instead, the book didn't just land. It detonated. It hit a nerve in the American psyche that was raw and exposed. The country was teetering on the edge of the civil rights movement. Sit-ins were happening at lunch counters. Freedom riders were boarding buses. The nation was having a violent, painful conversation about race, justice, and morality. And into this cauldron dropped a story that framed these massive, terrifying issues through the innocent eyes of a child. The success was immediate and overwhelming. The Book of the Month Club selected it. Reader's Digest condensed it. Within weeks, it was scaling the bestseller lists where it would remain for a staggering 88 weeks. In 1961, the Committee for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, often criticized for being too highbrow or obscure, could not ignore the phenomenon. They awarded the prize to Nell Harper Lee. But for Nell, this wasn't a victory lap. It was a nightmare. She was an introvert, a woman who cherished the shadows. Suddenly, she was the most famous woman in America. Reporters were camping on her lawn in Monroeville. Strangers were calling her phone. Everyone wanted a piece of her. She later described the success as just about as frightening as a quick, merciful death. She felt like a fraud. waiting for the world to realize she was just a ticket agent who got lucky. While the fame was terrifying, it brought one profound gift into her life: Gregory Peck. In 1962, Hollywood came calling. The film adaptation was fast-tracked, and Gregory Peck was cast as Atticus Finch. Nell was skeptical. She was protective of her father's image, and she feared Hollywood would turn her quiet, dignified story into a melodramatic spectacle. But when she met Peck, her defenses crumbled. He was not just an actor playing a role. He seemed to embody the spirit of A.C. Lee. He had the same quiet gravity, the same moral weight. Nell spent time on the set watching him work. There is a moment in the film, during the trial scene, where Peck finishes his closing argument. He takes off his glasses, rubs his eyes, and walks away. It is a gesture of profound weariness. When Nell saw it, she wept. It was her father. It was A.C. Lee, resurrected. The bond between the author and the actor became one of the most touching friendships in Hollywood history. When the film wrapped, Nell wanted to give Peck a gift. She went into her father's belongings. A.C. Lee had passed away in April 1962, just before the film was released, and retrieved his pocket watch. It was her father's most prized possession. She gave it to Gregory Peck. Months later, on the night of the Academy Awards, Gregory Peck sat in the audience, nominated for Best Actor. When his name was called, he stood up, walked to the podium, and accepted the Oscar. And tucked safely inside his tuxedo pocket, ticking against his heart, was A.C. Lee's watch. It was the perfect tribute. The fiction and the reality had merged completely. But while the public saw glory, the cracks in Nell's personal life were widening. And the biggest crack came from the person she loved most, Truman Capote. In late 1959, just before Mockingbird was published, Truman had called her. He was hysterical, excited, and needy. He had found a story. A wealthy wheat farming family, the Clutters, had been brutally murdered in a small town called Holcomb, Kansas. There were no witnesses, no apparent motive. It was a mystery that smelled of blood and intrigue. Truman wanted to write about it for The New Yorker, but he was terrified to go to Kansas alone. He knew he was too flamboyant, too New York, too gay for the conservative farmers of the Midwest. He needed a shield. He needed a translator. He needed Nell. Nell agreed. She put her own life on hold, packed her bags, and traveled with him to the frozen, desolate plains of Kansas. The dynamic in Holcomb was exactly as Truman had feared, and exactly as Nell had anticipated. Truman, in his sheepskin coat and long scarves, sashaying into the local post office, was treated like an alien species. The locals clamped up. They didn't trust him. Nell was the bridge. She dressed simply. She spoke with the slow, comforting drawl of the South. She talked to the wives about recipes and the church choir. She talked to the men about the weather and the crops. She made them feel safe. And once they felt safe with Nell, she introduced them to her friend, Truman. Without Harper Lee, In Cold Blood would not exist. It is that simple. For months they lived in a cheap motel. While Truman would often spend the evenings drinking martinis and complaining about the cold, Nell was the disciplined investigator. She did not use a tape recorder. The locals found them intimidating. Instead, she used a technique she had honed since childhood. She would listen intently, memorizing the conversation, and then run back to the motel room and write it down verbatim. Her memory was photographic. She compiled over 150 pages of single-space notes. She described the landscape, the weather, the specific way the Clutter family home smelled. She attended the trial of the killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, every single day. She befriended the lead investigator's wife, gaining access to files that Truman could never have touched. But as the months dragged into years, the dynamic shifted. In 1960, Mockingbird came out and won the Pulitzer. Truman was in Kansas when the news broke. He was furious. He was the genius. He was the literary darling. Nell was supposed to be his sidekick, his assistant. How dare she win the Pulitzer Prize? How dare she eclipse him? His jealousy began to fester like an infected wound. He mocked her success to their mutual friends, calling her book a children's story. He belittled her talent, but he still needed her. He needed her notes. He needed her to finish his book. The writing of In Cold Blood took 6 years. It destroyed Truman Capote. He developed a strange, intense relationship with the killers, particularly Perry Smith. He waited for them to be hanged so he could have an ending to his book. He was disintegrating into drugs and alcohol. Nell stood by him. She held his hand through the breakdowns. She edited his drafts. She gave him her 150 pages of notes, the spine of the book. When In Cold Blood was finally published in 1966, it was hailed as a masterpiece. It created a new genre, the nonfiction novel. Truman was the king of the world. He threw the famous black and white ball in New York, the party of the century. But when Nell opened her copy of the book, her heart stopped. She had expected to be listed as a co-author. At the very least, she expected a massive acknowledgement in the preface, detailing how the book was a joint effort. Instead, she found her name on the dedication page. It read, "For Jack Dunphy and Harper Lee." That was it. She was listed alongside his lover, Jack Dunphy, who had never set foot in Kansas. There was no mention of her research, her interviews, her years of work. In the hundreds of interviews Truman gave to promote the book, he never once mentioned her help. He claimed he had a perfect memory and had done it all himself. He had written her out of the legend. He had used her brilliance to build his masterpiece, and then he had discarded her to ensure that the spotlight shone on him and him alone. The betrayal cut Nell to the bone. It wasn't just professional. It was a violation of the deepest bond of her life. The boy she had protected in the schoolyard, the boy she had shared a typewriter with, had stabbed her in the back for the sake of his own ego. Nell never made a public scene. She didn't sue him. She didn't write an expose. She simply quietly, surgically cut him out of her life. The dynamic duo of American literature was dead. And as the 1960s came to a close, Nell Harper Lee looked at the literary world, a world of jealousy, betrayal, and hollow fame, and she made a decision. She stepped back. The silence began. With the door to her partnership with Capote firmly closed, Nell retreated from the limelight, leaving the public to speculate that the mockingbird had lost its song. Yet while the world assumed she was hiding in defeat, paralyzed by the betrayal and her own fame, Nell was actually sharpening her quill for a new battle. She wasn't hiding. She was working on a story that would test her commitment to the truth even more than her first masterpiece. After the mid-1960s, Harper Lee vanished from the public stage. To the outside world, the narrative was simple. She was a one-hit wonder who had been paralyzed by success, a recluse hiding in the backwoods of Alabama, afraid to type another word. But this was a lie. Nell was not idle. She was hunting. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, she was actively working on what was supposed to be her second book. It was not a novel. It was a work of nonfiction. She intended to do exactly what Truman Capote had done with In Cold Blood, but she intended to do it with the one thing Truman lacked: absolute moral integrity. The subject she chose was darker, stranger, and more terrifying than anything in Mockingbird. In the late 1970s, Nell became obsessed with a case in Alexander City, Alabama, involving a man named Reverend Willie Maxwell. Maxwell was a rural preacher, a man of deep charisma and terrifying reputation. Rumors swirled around him like flies. People whispered that he was a practitioner of voodoo, that he could curse you with a look. But the police were interested in something more tangible, insurance policies. Over a period of several years, 5 members of Maxwell's immediate family had died under mysterious circumstances. His first wife was found beaten to death. His second wife was found dead in her car. His brother, his nephew, and his stepchild all died. And in every single case, Reverend Maxwell held a lucrative life insurance policy on the deceased. He collected the money, bought fine suits, and preached on Sundays. The police knew he was guilty. The town knew he was guilty, but they couldn't prove it. Witnesses were terrified to speak against the voodoo preacher, fearing both his supernatural wrath and his very real physical retribution. Then the story took a turn that even Shakespeare couldn't have scripted. At the funeral of Maxwell's stepdaughter, his final alleged victim, the girl's uncle, a man named Robert Burns, stood up. He pulled out a pistol and shot Reverend Maxwell 3 times in the face, right there in the house of God, in front of 300 mourners. The town breathed a sigh of relief, but the legal drama was just beginning. The man who shot Maxwell was put on trial for murder. His defense attorney was a flamboyant local lawyer named Tom Radney. Radney managed to get the shooter acquitted by pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. Nell Harper Lee moved to Alexander City. She rented a motel room. She teamed up with Tom Radney, the lawyer. She spent years investigating the case. She had a title for the book, The Reverend. She wanted to dissect the racial politics of the Deep South in the 1970s, the corruption of the insurance companies that kept issuing policies to a known murderer, and the psychology of a serial killer who hid behind a pulpit. She worked tirelessly. She filled boxes with notes. She interviewed everyone. But she hit a wall built of her own conscience. Unlike Capote, who was willing to invent conversations and rearrange timelines to make a better story, Nell was shackled to the truth. And the truth of the Maxwell case was messy. The evidence against the Reverend was circumstantial. While she knew in her gut he was a murderer, she could not prove it definitively on the page without resorting to speculation. She wrestled with the manuscript for years. She wrote drafts and tore them up. She sent pages to her agent, then demanded them back. In the end, she abandoned the project. She could not reconcile the requirements of a gripping narrative with the requirements of factual accuracy. She told friends that she didn't have the facts. To Nell, a book that wasn't true wasn't worth writing. She refused to become Truman. She refused to sell her soul for a bestseller. So, The Reverend remains the great ghost of American literature, a masterpiece that exists only in boxes of notes and the memories of the few people she trusted. With the failure of The Reverend, Nell retreated further into what the press called her seclusion. But the image of Harper Lee as a trembling hermit, hiding behind curtains, was a media invention. She lived a vibrant, bifurcated life. She split her year between a simple rent-controlled apartment on the Upper East Side of New York and her sister Alice's house in Monroeville. In New York, she was a regular. She went to museums, attended the theater, and ate at local diners. She had a circle of friends who knew the rules. You could talk about anything, history, politics, the Mets, but you never ever talked about the book. She was funny, acerbic, and drank vodka with a splash of water. In Monroeville, she was just Miss Nell. She drove a beat-up car. She did her own laundry at the laundromat because she liked the hum of the machines and the lack of pretension. She ate breakfast at McDonald's, drinking coffee and reading the paper. She replied to fan letters, often with handwritten, witty notes, though she steadfastly refused almost all requests for interviews. She was protecting her peace. She had seen what fame did to people, what it did to Truman, and she wanted no part of it. The guardian of this peace was her older sister, Alice Lee. If A.C. Lee was Atticus Finch, then Alice Lee was the iron fortitude behind him. Alice was one of the first female lawyers in Alabama. She took over their father's law practice and ran it until she was 100 years old. She was brilliant, formidable, and fiercely protective of her baby sister. For decades, Alice handled all of Nell's business affairs. She reviewed the contracts, she frightened off the predatory reporters, she sued the local museum in Monroeville when they tried to sell cheap mockingbird souvenirs without permission. Nell hated the commercialization of her work. She wanted Mockingbird to be literature, not a brand. As long as Alice was alive and sharp, Nell was safe. Alice was the wall between Harper Lee and the world that wanted to consume her. Fast forward to the 2010s. The world had changed, but Nell Harper Lee had not. She was now in her late 80s. Her health was failing. She had suffered a stroke that left her wheelchair-bound. Her eyesight, once so sharp it could spot a detail from across a courtroom, was gone due to macular degeneration. Her hearing was fading. She moved into an assisted living facility in Monroeville, the Meadows. She was fragile. And then the wall fell. In November 2014, Alice Lee died at the age of 103. For the first time in her life, Nell was without her protector. She was without her father, without her mother, without Truman, and now without Alice. She was alone, vulnerable, and surrounded by people who managed her affairs. Less than 3 months after Alice was put in the ground, a bombshell announcement shook the literary world. A lawyer named Tanya Carter, who had taken over Alice's practice, announced that she had found a manuscript. It was a new Harper Lee novel. It was called Go Set a Watchman. The timing was suspicious. The narrative spun by the publishers was that the manuscript was discovered by chance in a safe deposit box attached to an original typescript of Mockingbird. But literary insiders and friends of Nell were skeptical. Had Alice known about this book all along and suppressed it to protect Nell? Was Nell, in her blind and deaf state, truly capable of consenting to its publication? Or was this a cash grab, orchestrated the moment the watchdog was dead? The world held its breath. Pre-orders skyrocketed. The second coming of Harper Lee was at hand, but no one was prepared for what was inside the pages of that lost manuscript. No one was prepared to see their hero fall. The loss of Alice removed the final barrier between Nell and the commercial machinery of the publishing world. With her guardian gone and her own faculties fading, the floodgates opened. What followed was not just a book launch, but a cultural firestorm that would dominate the final headlines of her life and force millions of readers to confront a painful, complicated reality about the hero they thought they knew. The summer of 2015 was not a celebration. It was a siege. When the news broke that HarperCollins would publish Go Set a Watchman, the literary event of the century quickly soured into a moral panic. The narrative spun by Tanya Carter, Nell's new lawyer, was one of serendipitous discovery, a lost manuscript found in a forgotten stack of papers. But to those who knew the history, the timeline was unsettling. Alice Lee, the fierce watchdog who had explicitly said Nell would never publish again, had been dead for only a few months. Nell herself was in a state of severe decline, largely blind and deaf, signing documents with a shaky hand. The state of Alabama intervened. The Alabama Securities Commission launched an investigation into potential elder abuse and financial fraud. They sent investigators to the Meadows to interview Nell. The question was simple. Did she understand what was happening? Did she want this? The investigators ultimately closed the case, stating that Nell appeared lucid and had consented to the publication. But the whisper campaigns never stopped. Was consent valid when the person giving it could not see the contract she was signing or hear the terms being read? Was this the final wish of a writer or the final exploitation of a cash cow? Regardless of the motive, the presses rolled. On July 14, 2015, Go Set a Watchman hit the shelves. Millions of readers rushed to buy it, expecting a sequel, a return to the warm embrace of Maycomb. They expected to see their hero, Atticus Finch, once again fighting for justice. Instead, they opened the book and found a stranger. The public finally held in their hands the very manuscript Tay Hohoff had rejected 50 years prior. They were reading the raw, unpolished cry of the young woman we saw in that cold New York apartment. In this version, Jean-Louise Scout Finch is 26 years old. She returns home from New York to find that Maycomb has changed, or perhaps that she has finally seen it clearly for the first time. The shock came when Scout finds a pamphlet in her father's house titled The Black Plague. It got worse. She follows Atticus to a meeting of the Citizens Council, a white supremacist organization dedicated to fighting desegregation. There, she watches in horror as her father, the man she worshipped as a god, sits and listens to a racist spew hate speech. The Atticus of Watchmen asks his daughter chilling questions. Do you want Negroes by the carload in our schools and churches and theaters? Do you want them in our world? The reaction was visceral. Readers felt betrayed. They felt as though their own father had turned on them. Atticus Finch was not just a character. He was a secular saint. He was the model of white moral courage. To see him revealed as a segregationist, a man who politely upheld a racist system, shattered the fantasy that To Kill a Mockingbird had maintained for 55 years. Critics argued that the book should never have been published, that it was a draft Lee had wisely discarded. They mourned the loss of the hero. But as the dust settled, a different, more complex view emerged. Perhaps Go Set a Watchman was necessary. To Kill a Mockingbird was a child's view of the world. It was a fairy tale where good fights evil, and even though good loses the court case, he wins the moral victory. It comforted white America. It told them, you are not all bad. There are good men like Atticus. Go Set a Watchman was the adult reality. It revealed that Atticus was not a god. He was a man of his time and place. It revealed that a man could be a loving father, a polite neighbor, and a gentleman, and still hold abhorrent views on race. It showed that the South wasn't just made of bad racists and good white saviors. It was complicated, messy, and contradictory. In a strange way, the publication of Watchmen completed the circle. It stripped away the mythology. It forced us to look at the roots of the oak tree, not just the pretty leaves. It aligned the fictional Atticus closer to the real A.C. Lee, a man who defended black men in 1919, but also upheld the segregationist laws of his era. Nell, trapped in her silent world at the nursing home, reportedly expressed satisfaction that the book was published. Though she could not read the reviews or hear the debates on television, she simply said, "I'm alive and kicking and happy as hell." The coda to her life came quickly after the storm. On the morning of February 19, 2016, less than a year after the release of Watchmen, Nell Harper Lee died in her sleep. She was 89 years old. Her funeral was exactly as she would have wanted it, simple, private, and devoid of pomp. It was held at the First United Methodist Church in Monroeville, the same church she had attended as a child with Truman Capote. The eulogy was delivered by a history professor, not a celebrity. There were no movie stars, just the people of Monroeville, sitting in the wooden pews, saying goodbye to the woman who had put them on the map. She was buried alongside her father, A.C. Lee, and her sister, Alice. The family plot is simple. The stone says Nell Harper Lee. Harper Lee left behind a legacy that is as contradictory as the South itself. For decades, we thought we knew her because we thought she was Scout. We projected our desires onto her. We wanted her to be the brave little girl who stood up to the mob. But Harper Lee was not Scout. She was a woman who wrestled with the madness of her mother, the cold ambition of her best friend, and the crushing, paralyzing weight of her own success. She was a writer who cared so deeply about the truth that when she couldn't find it in the Willie Maxwell case, she chose silence rather than fabrication. Think of her career like a great solitary tree standing in the middle of an Alabama field. Ghost set. A watchman is the roots, gnarled, ugly, hidden in the dirt, but real and strong. To Kill a Mockingbird is the trunk and the branches, manicured, reaching for the sky, offering shade and comfort to millions. They are different, yes, but they come from the same soil. Harper Lee once wrote through the voice of Atticus, "The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience." She lived by that. She wrote her truth. And when the world got too loud, when the fame became too toxic, and when the words wouldn't come right, she had the courage to stop. In a world that never stops talking, perhaps her silence was her greatest masterpiece of all.